Hi, Ed here with a favor to ask. We're in the middle of our annual donation appeal and would love it if you would consider supporting us in making the show. Energy versus Climate is a labor of love. David, Sarah, and I don't pay ourselves for the show because we feel strongly about the public service benefit of the project. We also don't run ads, so we can maintain 100% editorial independence. But the show still costs money to make. What little we do bring in from donors goes directly to hard production costs. You can help us to keep Energy versus Climate on the air by making a tax-deductible donation to the show today at energyversusclimate.com/donate. That's energyversusclimate.com/donate. Thanks for your support and enjoy the show. Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-hosts David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's energy challenges, highlighting the Canadian context. On November 22nd, we were back at the Energy Transition Centre in Calgary to record another show before a live audience. Thanks to Avatar Innovations for hosting us, and to Carbon Next for partnering with us through its Carbon Talk series. This time we took on the topic of carbon dioxide removal. CDR, as it's known by its acronym, has been newsworthy of late in the run-up to COP28 in Dubai. The three of us and the audience had a lot of fun with this conversation. We hope you do too. Here's the show. Tonight's show is in partnership with Foresight Canada and Carbon Management Canada's Carbon Next series called Carbon Talks. So if you recall, we were in this room about a year ago when we did a show on offsets, which ended up being our most downloaded show ever that we did live. And it might have something to do with our discussion about the problem of threesomes and David offering to pay $4 to me to drink 4 beers less than I normally would so he could get a beer offset credit.
Which I got, I believe.
Which you did, yeah.
And I've used it several times.
Yeah.
Because the credit accounting system's kind of broken down. So it's really allowed me to drink no beer while still having beer for quite a while.
That's right.
I think as the regulator, I've fallen down on my job here, clearly.
Yeah, well, you thought I was going to drink 50 beers that night. So, but today's topic is different. Today's topic is carbon removal. I think folks in this room know that the IPC and other bodies increasingly view carbon removal as a critical tool to reduce CO2 emissions and to bring warming back down to 1.5 C, either by century's end or, if you listen to our show with Zeke Housefather, perhaps by 2150 on the more pessimistic view. It seems like new carbon removal startups are sprouting up just about every week. Here's my little litmus test. Has anyone heard of Deep Sky? Yeah, I can't have a carbon removal conversation these days and not have Deep Sky come up. And David, how does it feel that carbon engineering has been supplanted as the cool carbon tech darling of Canada now by Deep Sky?
Actually, it feels so good to be involved in conversations now that it's definitively over and then I'm not involved anymore.
Well, there you go. There you go. Yes, David off the leash tonight.
Yeah.
Yes. Gosh, what he might say. But the barriers to commercializing carbon removal remain daunting. How much carbon do you think is being removed in Canada on a daily basis by all those startups that have been springing up? Any guesses? No, not zero, close to zero. So I've done this, near zero. It's 3 to 4 tons per day that's being removed, but it's catch and release because that's at Carbon Engineering Squamish demonstration plant. David, you have a comment on the catch and release.
No. That it doesn't count. But are there no, so I mean, the real action in long-term carbon removal right now is enhanced rock weathering, where there's going to be about 1 million tons a year globally claimed this year. And it's happening at extraordinary pace. There's at least some happening in Canada, but I don't know how much. Or maybe...
Okay. So I don't know. We'll get into that. But when I do this other exercise in any group I get together with, it's zero. But there's lots of talk about it. So we're going to do a deep dive today. We're going to talk about the technological pathways, the various forms of carbon removal. But then we're also going to talk about, frankly, try to separate what's real and what's hype. Because I think I can go out on a limb and say that carbon removal, we might be at peak hype cycle right now. So to do that, Dave and I are going to start. Tell us why does carbon removal matter, like in the sort of the highest level?
Carbon removal matters because long-term climate change is proportional to cumulative emissions. So even if we eliminate emissions, we've just stopped the climate problem getting worse. In the long run, if you want to remove the climate risk or reduce the climate risk on kind of a century or 2-century timescale, you have to take the carbon back out of the atmosphere into permanent storage. I think that's really just sort of a geophysical fact. On shorter timescales, you can talk about solar geoengineering, but I think the underlying reality is that even if we get to net zero and have trumpets and celebrations in 2050 or 2100, it'll still be much warmer than it is. There will still be much more violent storms and other impacts and actually accelerating sea level rise. And that won't stop because we eliminate emissions. If we want to reduce those risks, you have to either take CO2 out of the air or do solar geoengineering or some combination.
And you've written, I remember you wrote an op-ed in the New York Times that said there are only 2 ways to cool the planet in this century. One is through carbon removal and the other is through climate engineering. Why this century? Like why the mitigation things that we're doing now, like all the renewable electricity we're deploying, why won't that cool the planet in this century?
It doesn't it reduces the amount we're warming it up further, but it doesn't cool it. The climate change is caused by the emissions we made in the past. At any given time, climate change is caused by the carbon we've already emitted. And nothing we change about emissions changes that. So if you want to deal with the impact of the carbon we've emitted, emissions cuts are irrelevant. Emissions cuts are absolutely relevant and crucial. What they do is reduce our future contribution to warming. But it's a different thing.
Okay, and quick, just...
So if you actually want to make it cooler, physically cooler, emissions cuts doesn't do it.
Okay. And then just quick, this audience is pretty literate, but carbon removal is not carbon capture, utilization, and storage. What's the difference?
Carbon removal means moving carbon from the atmosphere, which is connected with the ocean and with the active surface biosphere, back to long-lived reservoirs. In some sense, it's undoing what humanity did with burning carbon. We've dug up this fossil carbon that's been there in some cases for hundreds of millions of years, and we put it in the active biosphere. That's what causes climate change and has this footprint that will last for tens or hundred thousands of years if we don't change it. And carbon removal is the idea that we could take carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in some permanent long-term storage.
And people talk about long duration carbon removal and short duration. What do they mean when they use those 2 terms?
So no fixed meaning, but I think roughly the answer is if you increase the stock of carbon in biomass, that is in trees or soils or what have you, you've absolutely done some good. You've shifted carbon from the atmosphere back to the land biosphere. But that doesn't change the very long-term future because there's always equilibration between those in the sense that if it gets warmer, the forest may burn or the soils may oxidize. So those produce a short-term benefit, but they don't change the long-term carbon cycle. And people often want to have one is good and one is bad. So sometimes people will assume there's no benefit to short-term, people who kind of think there's too much hype about trillion trees. But that's not right. If somebody can give you a cost-free way to remove a ton now and release the ton in 50 years, that's actually worth a fair amount to climate policy. So there's certainly a value in short-term removal. It's just not the same as long-term removal.
So I've discovered, and because of your former clean tech darling, carbon engineering, in Canada at least, some people use carbon removal synonymously with direct air capture. But direct air capture is one technology pathway. Can you give us a little tour de table of the different carbon removal technology pathways?
So broadly, I think you can think of carbon removal in 2 broad categories based on the endpoint. So either, if you're talking about permanent CO2 removal, either it's going as carbon dioxide, which, chemistry here is oxidized carbon, which you basically inject underground using oil patch type technology, or you're making a stable salt. So CO2 is a weak acid. If you mix that CO2 with a base, you make a salt, and that salt might be dissolved in the ocean or made solid, but it doesn't matter. In either cases, in a geochemical sense, that's permanent removal. And you can divide the carbon removal landscape up into what are the 2 endpoints. So if you do biomass burning, where you capture the CO2 and inject underground, or you do direct air capture, where you capture the CO2 and inject underground, but you don't use a tree, in both those things, you're removing carbon and you're putting it deep underground as CO2. The other main technologies are enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity, and they are actually 2 ways to do the same thing. To be the most nerdy I can be, they're to add cations to the ocean. So the ocean has an immense amount of carbon in it that is no trouble to us for climate because it is balanced, the carbonate ions, the carbon acid is balanced by a base. And that's what naturally is going to happen anyway. If we just all disappear tomorrow, humanity is taken away into the hereafter, the warm climate and the carbonic acid, the weak acid from carbon, will weather a bunch of basic rocks to make a stable salt, and that's what's going to remove the CO2. And that stable salt may be dissolved in the ocean or solid, but in either case, you permanently remove the CO2. So for enhanced rock weathering, where you're grinding up some of these basic rocks, like granitic rocks or serpentinite or whatever, and you're spreading them in agricultural soils, sort of using agricultural technology, or if you're doing a sort of different process and putting them directly in the ocean, in both cases, the goal is to have this base run off into the ocean where it will neutralize CO2. So that, to me, in terms of the main long-term permanent carbon removal, it's either BECCS or DAC doing injection underground, or it's enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity, making in the end mostly a balanced carbon in the ocean.
Thank you. And I just want to say for the record, although that was not that was nerdy, that's not the most nerdy that you've ever been, as someone knows.
Thanks for
you
that.
can go
Yeah,
nerdier
I appreciate that. Okay.
than that.
Shall I try?
Yeah. Okay. Last question, then we're going to bring Sarah into the conversation. So we just did this exercise, and we don't think that much carbon removal is happening in Canada. It's a bit of a question mark, and if anyone can figure that out before the show is over, aside from Squamish, feel free to raise it in the Q&A. Give us a sense of what degree or some of the examples of carbon removal that are happening worldwide.
So actually, I think this was where it really matters to separate the two timescales. So I used to teach, as some of you may know, in Eastern U.S., and this university started with an H. And one thing I would often say to my students at Harvard there is that they should go into Western Massachusetts and look at all these beautiful hardwood forests. This is going somewhere, don't worry, that have stone walls inside the forests. And what that teaches you is that land had all been cut for agriculture. In this first big agriculture boom in the 1850s, all of that was clear. Then agriculture moved west, and all that regrew from trees. So in fact, if you look at the net carbon balance of much of the eastern U.S., it's negative if you count the forests, because those forests are regrowing quickly and pulling carbon out of the air. But you can't count that as a permanent carbon benefit unless you count the reverse, because of course all that carbon is only coming out of the air in that forest because it went into the air when we burned all those trees in 1850 or roughly. So the point is, if you're just talking carbon removal, not taking time scale, it's places like eastern US where regrowing forests is the big thing. If you're talking permanent carbon removal today, there are a few BECCS projects that are real. There's no direct air capture projects that are substantial. There's Orca's 10 kilotons or 4 or 10 kilotons a year. But the big one for sure is enhanced rock weathering, which is happening at this breakneck, head-spinning pace, where there's now, as I said, about 1 million tons of removal we claim this year.
And where are those projects happening?
A whole bunch in the U.S., a bunch in the U.K., there's others, but those are the two I know the best, yeah.
Got you. So Sarah, your sort of high-level take on carbon removal, dividing substance between hype. What are your thoughts? Will it live up to its hype? The costs are daunting. Learning curves may kick in. They may not. Give us your sense.
Yeah, there's a lot in there that I guess we'll continue to unpack. I don't know. I imagine that we could even go a little bit higher in the hype cycle than I think we are now. I don't think we reached the peak, but I guess we'll see. I think, to me, the biggest piece that's concerning around the conversation now, and that I think is really going to, cause a problem later on, if you want, is how exactly we imagine to pay for this, and in particular, how we imagine to pay for it sort of within the political structures that we have, right? And so a lot of the ways that we talk about the kinds of policy approaches, and we'll get into this more, to incentivize the development of new technologies are really leaning on, arguably a lot of the successes of other technologies that we've talked about on the pod, right? On things like renewable energy, on things like EVs, different technologies that are lower carbon than their conventional alternatives, and that have, started out as more expensive, but through deployment and R&D are coming down the cost curve and are arguably in some cases cheaper than, or, may soon be cheaper than their conventional alternative. And we have a pretty good, I think a pretty good track record now and understanding of how to do that on a policy side. Not to say it's easy, but at least we, maybe know where we're going. warming. But I think what we haven't confronted when it comes to CDR is that fundamentally, no matter how good you get at it and how cheap it gets, there is some component to this that's about, doing something in addition. And the value of doing that thing is clear in a climate perspective, right? And there's all kinds of good reasons that we want to reduce the warming that we have already locked in and not see it increase more in the future. But we haven't, I would argue, really found a way to get people to pay for that at scale. And so all these great tools that we have to increase deployment and drive costs down, we could choose to do those, and maybe we will when it comes to carbon direct removals. But we're still going to reach some future end, point and date where companies are going to look around and say, well, it's gotten a lot cheaper, but who's going to keep paying for this? And I don't think that we really have an answer to that yet. And maybe we can get into different ways that we might do that. And I think border carbon adjustments are maybe one way that can work at the margins for products and carbons that are traded. But I think it is going to require a more significant kind of political structural change than we have for any of the other types of technologies that we have talked about when it comes to reducing emissions.
Sure. So I agree. We haven't figured out how to pay for it at scale. We don't have the tools in place. Now, the same case applies to carbon capture. Because if you look at carbon capture, and we just had the fall economic statement yesterday, and it said that the feds, sorry, I'm drifting into policy. We'll have a long chat about policy, but allow me to drift in. The feds have a CCUS investment tax credit. They're going to pay up to 50% of the capital cost of a carbon capture project, and some of them are $1 billion or $1.3 billion or whatever the case may be. And still, the developers say, we don't have enough of incentive to go ahead and build. It's great to have that capital covered, but we need our OPEX covered, and you've got an industrial carbon pricing system that right now is too low. And oh, by the way, in 2025, it may go away. So this is the case with a whole bunch of technologies that are higher end of the cost abatement curve. So, I mean, carbon removal is just one of those. Shouldn't we be willing, in order to try to bring those learning curves down and bring the cost down, shouldn't we have a high willingness to pay for those higher cost ones that we see, the IPCC tells us, are fundamental to getting a handle on the climate problem?
So, I mean, you're completely right that carbon capture and storage, I think I would say, though, is the other one. I don't think that there are a lot of others that are like this. And as you pointed it out, with the sort of catch and release joke, that even, Emily Grubert down at Notre Dame has pointed out in a paper that depending on how carbon capture and storage incentives are, how the rules are actually created for that, you could have a case where, you have significant federal funds that go to actually build out carbon capture and storage infrastructure. And ultimately, when those credits run out, companies could be incentivized to just simply turn it off. Or, if the rules don't insist that they store that carbon, they could release it again. The same, of course, could be true when it comes to carbon removals. And so, so I think you're spot on that it's not just carbon direct removals, it's carbon capture and storage as well. But those two, I think, are very different from the other types of technologies that we talk about because, again, fundamentally, they do something useful, but the useful thing they do is always going to come at some additional cost, and you have to have somebody who's willing to pay for that useful thing. And that's more challenging to do than when it comes to somebody paying for electricity or paying for mobility or these other things that we might want to do.
So David is looking deeply skyward. Deep sky. You like that? Gratuitous pandering to deep sky. I hope the founders are listening. What do you think?
I think it's a really tough question because I feel like I can argue Sarah's side and the opposite side, and there's some strength to both arguments. So, I mean, of course, it's not like all the unbelievable success of wind and solar and batteries, which collectively, between the three of those, we're now spending more than $1 trillion a year on globally. It's not like that all happened smoothly or all happened just because the market wanted it. There were a whole set of incentives that made it, and those incentives at different times also were silly and wasted a lot of money. So we did, in some cases, build solar and wind projects that didn't have great integration in some places and so on. And fundamentally, those things happened because of public policy, not just because people wanted the cheapest thing or they wouldn't have had it. So on the one hand, I want to say, well, this is no different. It's just because of that. But to agree with you, I think it's very hard to think of a case. It's easy to think of lots of prior history where governments have in different ways pushed pollution cleanup. And it was always hard to pay from, but we pushed pollution cleanup, and that goes back centuries. But there's something different about pushing local cleanup where you regulate the polluter or you somehow move money around to get the polluter not to pollute than to say you're going to pay somebody totally separately to make the negative of that pollution. It's hard to think of a real analog to that in history.
Yeah, and I think completely agree that along the pathway, of course you can spend a lot of money. And as you said, we have spent a lot of money and, people have tried to argue whether or not, that was good value, and we try to waste as little of it as possible. I think my concern is around that endpoint and exactly that difference. Again, we've obviously seen great kinds of local pollution cleanup. You think about scrubbers on coal plants or, various things that people have done that have impacted local air or local water and things like that. That's a lot easier, I would argue, politically, obviously, to support. And so the question is, do we have really the kind of global governance, or do we have within individual countries, the kinds of social movements or whatever it's going to take to actually get governments to, and the argument I think would be that if there's money out there sort of in the economy, then obviously it's not that there is an inability to pay for it fundamentally, but what is the fair way of sharing paying for that?
I think the magic economist answer is pretty simple. It's to say you have a clean carbon price and nothing else, and you're penalized X dollars a ton for emitting CO2, but you also would get paid exactly the same X dollars for cleanly removing a ton of CO2. That's great at the level of an econ paper. It's really not the way the world actually works.
Yeah, it's not the way, and certainly not the way that carbon pricing has worked in Canada. If you look at our carbon price OBPS, output-based pricing system, on the margins with the free allocations, and now we've got a federal government on the retail carbon tax side that is coming up with exemptions for home heating oil, which is just cutting out the legs beneath its own system. But so now I want to take us to policy, and I want to look at the U.S., where the company that you were formerly associated with before you went off the leash is building a 500 kiloton project in the Permian Basin in Texas. And my understanding is it's entirely because of policy. You've got the 45Q support, which pays now, it's enhanced support, $180 per ton per pure sequestration, $130 a ton if you're using it for enhanced oil recovery. You've got a California LCFS market that says we don't care where your direct air capture project is. If you generate credits, you can sell into our market and you don't have to be a regulated entity. And you have a Department of Energy loans program that is willing to take technology risk. Equals taking FID on a project, even if, and I think the costs are $450 a ton for the first plant. Sorry, not supposed to say that publicly. Can we strike that from the record, please? Yeah.
I'm gonna say that it would be nice if they were that price.
Oh.
But I think that those are the dominant drivers. But I don't want to totally underestimate a kind of long-term bet that at some level Oxy and other players think that in the long run, independent from exactly what government's doing today, they think that in the long run the cost of removal actually might be less than the costs of cutting emissions in different parts of the economy, and that they're guessing policy will eventually drive it that way. I think that is part of it. If it was just that, they wouldn't do it. They needed the short-term incentives. But it's not only the short-term incentives.
Sure. And so as an example there, I think SAF, if you're trying to buy SAF, a sustainable aviation fuel, it's really hard to get. So I know an airline, All Nippon Airways, that has done this deal with Carbon Engineering, was in San Francisco, bought one batch of SAF, and then found it couldn't buy a second batch. And the cost is something like $750 to $1,000 a ton. So even though you go, now that you're off the leash, and maybe $450 per ton is lowball, it's probably not $750 to $1,000 a ton.
Mm-hmm.
Not that off the leash yet. Yeah. As a quick aside, because I heard you speak about this in Ottawa at Carbon Removal Canada's launch, and maybe you spoke about that earlier in the day, can you just tell that little story of how difficult it is to estimate, like the folly of trying to estimate on a cost per ton basis what these projects will actually deliver?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that, but I do want to come back. I want to get in one or two things. I'll take the last piece first. So one is a bunch of current action in the space is driven by voluntary sales, this sort of voluntary carbon market. And nobody knows, but my personal guess is the voluntary carbon market will not end up it'll be important in stimulating some of this early investment, but it won't be a significant part of the long-term thing. I just don't think companies in the long run really pay a lot of money they don't have to, especially as there become regulations to do X. They're not going to pay separately to do X just for fun. So I don't think that'll be a big player. The comment there was about it's easy in the literature, especially in the academic literature, I can criticize academics, to find all sorts of very precise estimates for how much future technologies will cost. And it's important to say we just really lack the ability to estimate this. And we get sometimes groups of experts in national academy panels or various expert groups that will look at, say, direct air capture or nuclear power or whatever and say the cost is between X and Y. And I think it's important to say a lot of these groups are sort of a group of like 10 really amazing people, but without any big staff support, who meet for a couple of weeks and come up with this number. If you could get 10 amazing people to come up for a few weeks and accurately predict the cost of some future technology that isn't in the market yet, the answer is people like that would get paid fortunes by venture capital and equity to do that. And they're not. And the reason is because we just don't have the predictive skill. So I think we've had a bunch of these panels of big shots that have estimated these costs, and from my perspective, they tell you essentially nothing.
So Sarah, and I don't want to say hard to abate, because Rebecca Dell has trained us out of we had her on the pod, and nothing is easy to abate. So this is a cautionary tale for everyone. Scrub hard to abate from your lexicon. There's no sector that is truly easy to abate. Some heavy industry emissions cost more than other industry emissions. So with something like aviation, I mean, globally there are very few, regulations. Domestically, we have nothing on aviation, right? You cover it with the clean fuel regulation. But otherwise, I mean, we're leaving it up to the airline companies that crisscross our skies every day to kind of do their own thing. It's only when they land in the EU that they actually face a SAF mandate. So it's putting you on the spot here. This is not in the notes, but with something like aviation, because SAF being like $750,000 a ton, and then carbon removal being, 400, let's say $500 a ton, then would you not want the aviation companies all day, every day, instead of spending that money on SAF, to just pay to have that carbon taken out of the sky?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on that. I mean, I think it's a good general point around, when you look across all the sectors that we have to decarbonize, which if we're going to get to net zero is all of them, I think you would go through and say, is this one that we have technologies that we could implement to reduce emissions directly? And, if yes, what are those costs? And if not, then, how large are those emissions? And is the scale of those something that we could, hope to kind of tackle through some kind of carbon direct removals? From a policy question of, what you should do or which way you should go, I mean, to David's point before, a lot of these technologies that are now cheap were once really expensive, right? And I mean, solar was once unimaginably expensive, right? You think about how much it cost 20 years ago, think about how much it cost 50 years ago, right? It's sort of the sky is literally the limit, as they were flying solar panels on satellites, and that's about it. But so I think we do have to be a bit careful and a bit cautious. And I think if you go back and kind of look at these so-called, hard to abate technology sectors with quotes around them for Rebecca Dell, there are sectors where kind of people previously said, oh, well, there's really nothing that we can do. And, oh, actually, wait, no, it turns out, maybe we can use hydrogen to make steel. So like if we try a little bit harder, or really rather, if we're forced to do something other than what we've just always done, because that's going, of course, to be the easiest to continue, then we might manage there. So I think it's, without having a lot of deep insight into the aerospace place, I would say just in general, when you're presented with a technology and someone says, well, this is really, really expensive, so therefore it's, not worth pursuing and we should do this other thing instead. I think you have to be a bit cautious because, most of these technologies start out at high cost. But coming back to kind of the policy side and what is the role of regulations to force kind of change within different sectors, I think that's a perfect sector to say, well, maybe you do work work to try to bring down the cost of sustainable aviation fuels. But maybe there does need to be more of a global agreement around, requiring some amount of carbon direct removals to be funded by aviation companies, right? And one might even think that would be one of the easier sectors to start with, because it sort of already naturally cuts across, country boundaries, and maybe that comes with its own challenges from a policy perspective, but maybe in some ways it actually makes it a bit easier to kind of tackle the sector as a whole and get above these country level differences. I imagine if you brought that to a bunch of airline CEOs, they would be very quick to say, that sounds well and good, but we don't necessarily want to be the ones that pay for that, right? Which I think gets you back again to that initial challenge of, and how are you actually going to move this forward, and to which, maybe some of this voluntary market is an important starting point. And there's no reason that these two things are happening at the same time, but I think there is a little bit of an implosion of the offset market, right, that we had talked about last year. I think there is sort of a reckoning happening now on that. And, we may walk away from that, I think, either with a strengthened market for CDR as almost like the replacement of, the offset market is maybe not so great, and so companies that are really, truly committed to doing something here see that as an alternative, or CDR gets sort of caught in the crossfire and goes down with the rest of the offset market. And I think it's maybe a little, I could imagine both of those playing out. I guess next year we'll have to come back and see which happened.
We're going to talk about offsets only because we crassly want to boost download numbers for this show. So, David, weigh in.
It's so hard to guess how climate policy will evolve in the long run. One interesting thing about just the existence of carbon removal, permanent carbon removal, whichever version you happen to like or think is going to work, is it allows a really different thing in climate policy. It allows a kind of take-back rule, perhaps at a national level. Instead of based on price, it says that basically, in some level, countries are responsible, arguably over a couple hundred years, for removing all the carbon they historically put in their country boundaries. Obviously, it's difficult for countries that have changed boundaries, but I think it's interesting to think about it. It opens up a new space in how to think about it. I guess I want to add on that in one kind of hype and unhype. So in terms of visibility and hype, it's certainly very high for carbon removal. And I'd say there's a whole lot of startups that seem to me to be jokes, and I think there's a bit of a bubble. On the other hand, in terms of total money, it's actually pretty small. So we're now spending more than $1 trillion a year on basically wind, solar, and batteries, which is fantastic. And I don't know exactly what the total amount of money is on permanent carbon removal, but it's less than 10 billion, maybe less than 5. So it's significantly less than 1% of what we're spending on emissions cuts. And to me, that's about right. In the sense, if you ask me kind of as a citizen, what fraction of the total amount of money spent on cutting emissions we should be spending on permanent carbon removal now, my answer would be, a percent or so. And then like in 20 years, a few percent, with the idea that what we're really doing with carbon removal now is figuring out what works and doesn't and what the costs are. And carbon removal doesn't really matter until emissions are a long way down.
So I do want to flag, so I'd love to talk more about historical emissions. I'd want to get back to offsets as well. I'm trying to think of how to merge the two. But on the funding number, so Carbon Removal Canada, new NGO, and full disclosure, I had a hand in setting it up, recently put out a launch report, and it said in Canada, so on this question of startups every week, there are 69 companies apparently that are involved in everything. They're developers, they're doing BECCS, they're doing mineralization, they're doing a whole bunch of things, and carbon engineering would be among those. But the total spend, and I don't know if carbon engineering be factored into this, was something like $200 million over, I think, the duration when they looked at those companies. But it's still a drop in the bucket, because I think they went back to 2013 or 2015. It's still a drop in the bucket of what's being spent.
Well, if that's right, then it was kind of all CE.
Yes. Let's tackle offsets first, and let's come back to historical emissions, because I do want to kind of discuss and debate this idea. It's like Microsoft has done. It's like and we're big, rich Microsoft, and we own Chat GPT and OpenAI, and we just reinstalled Sam.
No, they don't. You're behind the times.
I know. Well, no, he's back in, but basically it was Microsoft intervening. And I have to go back to the Daily Podcast to remember his last name, Sam Altman. But going back to offsets, Sarah. So you comment on things like the clean electricity regulation, the oil and gas emissions limit. I saw you on the panel, the Canadian Climate Institute, speaking very capably about that. Those are going to have, well, CER TBD, oil and gas emissions limit, if it's ever done before 2025 and a certain government loses power, then there's going to be some big offsets component. And do you think then for that offsets component to be credible, that regulated entities who are buying offsets should have some portion in their portfolio that is carbon removal? And since the feds are developing a direct air capture plus sequestration protocol, that it should be driven through that federal protocol?
Okay, two-part question.
And a leading question at that, but yes, two-part and leading.
What is the right answer, Ed? I mean, I guess there's different ways to answer that, right? In terms of if I try to channel the inner economist, they would say the point of carbon pricing or these broad-based regulations is actually to be more tech neutral, right, and not to require specific mechanisms for emissions reductions. So should there have to be real emissions reductions that are credibly additional that wouldn't have happened otherwise if we're going to have any offsets, then, yes, do those have to be CDR? I don't think that there's a clear reason that they have to be those. And I mean, to David's point, I don't think there's any reason that they have to be direct air capture as opposed to other forms of carbon direct removal. The fact that there's that interest in that in Canada, I think comes a little bit back to this other point that I'll raise is, another challenge that I see in sort of this pitch of like, oh, well, Canada could become this great CDR hub because we have, good geological storage, or we're going to, kind of become the place that people go to buy these offsets. And I think the challenge that I see with that is that there's two pieces, I think, to what will drive where those purchases happen, right? And so one is obviously where it's cheap and you can do these things. You have the infrastructure. And so I heard David on his earlier panel pointing out, where you have the electricity, if you're going to do direct air capture, if you're going to try to put this stuff underground, where of course that all is going to matter. But I think what's going to matter almost as much, if not maybe in some cases more, is the economic activity and jobs that go along with that, in so much as governments are actually able to force these things to happen. And I think it's probably hard enough for countries to force CDR to happen within their own boundaries, to then go and, force an entity, to force a corporation within your country to go and pay for that somewhere else, or to actually have the government go and invest public money to pay for that somewhere else, is a pretty tall order, right? And we know that governments, when they have, kinds of procurement and innovation, they tend to like to procure things from within their own country boundaries. So, I think that the idea that might be the way that some of these are set up in Canada, I think exactly, I would argue is really a reflection of exactly the way that we might see this market evolve, and where, in so much as we have public money that does go into buying this, emissions reductions, it may really be hard to do that outside of the country boundaries.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead, Dave.
I have a tie between carbon offsets and permanent carbon removal. And a friend of mine who's near the top of Frontier, this fund that's spending about $1 billion to drive the carbon offset market, she is in fact skeptical about some of what they're doing. And she told me that one of the things she thought was maybe one of the few things that'd be really useful from all this is it would help to puncture the offset bubble by showing there's something different. And clue, she was on our show before. So I think that it is real, actually, that one potential use of permanent carbon removal, even if it's not in the near term, I think incrementally doing much to actually remove carbon, is it may help to point out the silliness of some of the offset market.
Yeah. But so then there's Article 6 or 6.2, and apparently that Switzerland is working with Iceland through Climeworks and its project Orca to do an Article 6.2 deal. So that's crossing boundaries. Mm-hmm. It is within the UNFCCC framework. Sarah, you talked about sort of one government sort of looking abroad and perhaps sourcing from up. If it's through that article, are you comfortable with it?
Oh, to be clear, I'm not saying that governments shouldn't do that. I'm just saying that governments that are not as rich as the Swiss government might be more hesitant to do so.
The Swiss government is not typically a good benchmark for what's like economically effective.
So, Sarah, just
They make really nice watches, though.
to build on that, should Canada get Article 6 credits for exporting its low-carbon LNG to East Asia to displace coal-fired electricity in China? Will you go on the record to say it should?
I will say I would be surprised if China, whoever is going to actually buy that LNG and use it, would want to give those up.
Just want to put people on notice. I think in a few minutes we'll get to Q&A. David, so what's the opportunity here for Canada? So in this report, Carbon Removal Canada hired Navius, and they said, listen, it can be creating 300,000 jobs, to your point, 143 billion of GDP by 2050. Canada has these assets. It's got, gigatons worth of geologic storage, and especially here in the Western Sedimentary Basin in Alberta and Saskatchewan. It's got the people from the oil and gas industry who know how to, turn wrenches and build the equipment. It's got the moral obligation as well. And, we'll see. It's got a federal government that right now is sort of sympathetic to it, and apparently a government in waiting that likes carbon tech, not taxes. So can Canada actually be a leader in this space?
So I've been thinking about that report, and Navius will turn knobs to 11 for a fee. I don't think it'll be 300,000, but I actually don't think, say, the existence of pore space for disposal is that special, because sedimentary basins are pretty widely distributed around the world. I think if I think of where Canada's niche might be, and what the kind of fundamental things that we have that are useful for carbon removal as I see it, which is evolving. One thing we have is a really big mining sector, and we have a big ag sector. And I think if you put those together, I kind of think about enhanced rock weathering or some things that come off that, maybe a little bit, and BECCS, which I think globally biomass with carbon removal is not going to be that big a play because there's just a limit to how much biomass you can do without really big environmental impacts. But Canada has a relatively high tree to people ratio compared to other countries. So it feels like it's more plausible that it plays a bigger role here.
Yeah, and just to point out, so the feds are developing this DAC plus sequestration protocol. Their next protocol is going to be a BECCS protocol, an offset protocol. Sarah.
I did want to come back to something that you raised earlier that I think is really an interesting point of sort of how that might play out in terms of what carbon removal might allow us to do in sort of these international negotiations that I think, one of the sort of fundamental fairness questions that we do run into, head on, and I think we arguably it's almost impossible to make progress on is how do you account for past emissions? How quickly should countries that are, say, developing now and raising their standard of living, but still significantly lower in terms of standard of living than we enjoy here in Canada or in the US on average, what kind of rate of change should they be expected to achieve in decarbonization when, we raise our standard of living here on the back of large amounts of emissions? And so I almost see, and I think it's a much more complicated space, but you mentioned the idea that CDR could sort of be useful in being clear within the offset space about what's useful and what's not. And I could imagine a sort of similar thing that could happen, in a great, wonderful future where we all get together and agree on, what we're trying to achieve. But at least it maybe could make it slightly easier to have these global climate negotiations if there is a much clearer, agreement of every country, every person, kind of whatever the right metric is, gets to have a certain amount of carbon emissions, and those need to be zeroed out by a certain year. And you sort of avoid some of that, back and forth of, it was a different time, but at the same time, that created a great benefit.
I think there's something real there. I mean, obviously, international law is not like national law, and there's not, it is always going to be power matters, and it's not going to be perfect. But I think also principles and ethical principles aren't irrelevant. And so I think these principle of loss and damages, it says that to some extent the countries that have caused the most emissions that are causing warming, which is most harmful to hot, poorer countries. I think the idea that there should be some transfer because we actually can now calculate with better econometrics what the impact is in hot countries. I think there's something there that's real. hot countries won't get what they want, but they might get something. And I think likewise, this idea to say in a way that allows you, as you said, to keep the economy inside your boundary, not to just pump money outside, but to say we're going to take the carbon back and to, at some level, and the point is it can be adjustable, you can say that by some date you will have removed 10% of your historical emissions. I think that might be important sort of new degree of freedom in international climate politics.
I guess, though, when do we introduce that? Because I think we might agree to that in principle. The people in this room might agree to that in principle. And yet I'd say outside, I'd argue that it sounds like woolly-headed intellectualism. And you're trying to talk to Pierre Poilievre and say, not only do you have to hit net zero, not only do you have to reduce the oil and gas sector's emissions to get it down by, what's the 40%, Kevin? Yeah, 42% by 2030. You have to white map your historical emissions. That's now the moral obligation.
I won't waste a second talking to Pierre about that, to be clear. but
although we'd pay money to see that, David, we'd pay money.
But I think that's also not quite fair. I think in the near term, that is to me in the next 20 years, the focus of action should be entirely on cost-effective decarbonization. And we're not, I think, in the next 20 years, going to have a substantial fraction of the total action be carbon removal. But because it takes a long time to develop these technologies, and not just the hardware, but the regulatory infrastructure and the system, now is the time to put money in developing these things so we could really use them, so our kids could really use them, or our grandkids. And so I think you can walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yeah, and maybe one place to start that actually is closer to home, right? Because we have very similar conversations around fairness and emissions reductions and emissions and the value of those emissions here in Canada. So, again, understanding that, of course, it's easy to make big statements and plans and implementing them are actually trickier, but that this maybe does help you to be able to sort of tackle that fairness argument head on and say, well, if you created a lot of emissions in a certain province by doing something that, was economically very advantageous, that's, the crux, I think, of one of the challenges of should we shut that down or not naming any provinces or industries in particular. But if you had a way to be able to, in theory, pay to then remove those emissions, you could say, well, okay, but as long as it's, economically makes sense to do so, then have at it.
I have an idea. I believe that Danielle Smith and her government has paid some actually Eastern consultants to calculate how much the rest of Canada owes Alberta from the pension plan, and the number's very large. So, and I actually believe the number's probably correct, although I'm not a big supporter of Danielle Smith's, what she wants to do with it. But what we could do is maybe get some other Eastern Canadian consultants, because that seem to live there, to calculate Alberta's historical CO2 emissions versus Ontario's or Quebec's at a carbon price, and maybe we could just kind of adjust one variable number so those numbers came out the same, and then we got a nice stalemate.
So if you want to bilk, I like that. We both heard the Premier speak about that a few weeks ago at the Banff Forum. And we heard Jason Kenney prior to that say, I got that report and I stuck it in the bottom of my desk drawer, never to see the light of day.
Didn't Jason Kenney say something about Poilievre being his Frankenstein's ex?
Yeah, that's right, because he was an aide in Kenney's office. So I like that. If you want to bilk the Canada Pension Plan for 54% of its value, then you have to absorb 54% of the cost, say, or whatever number it is. And we can have Bill Morneau and his firm do the analysis.
Yeah,
of Canada's historical emissions.
We got I think we just solved Confederation right
I think,
here.
yeah.
All right.
That wouldn't be contentious at all. Yeah. Quid pro quo. That's what our Confederation is about. Okay, we've been chatting amongst the three of us for long enough. Let's turn it to the audience for your questions and comments. Future Ed here, jumping in to say that we had a bit of a mic difficulty during our Q&A. So if our audience questioners sound a little different, it's because we had them re-record their questions for clarity. Now back to the show. Rob Tremblay.
First and foremost.
Thanks, Ed. This is a question about CDR's ability to scale up. So I was just Googling how much of a carbon footprint Air Canada has and found that Air Canada had a carbon footprint of 13 megatons pre-pandemic. So say they just wanted to, offset all of that with CDR. Are we able to, maybe to put some bounds on that? Say they wanted to do it by 2030, would they be able to do that? So how ready is CDR to scale up to meet the needs of someone like an airline? Thanks.
It's really interesting. I would have said very far away, but I think it really is changing. So it's hard for me to know how real it is, but Oxy, who bought Carbon Engineering, has talked about the King Ranch site, and they talked about it as a publicly traded company, and there's a lot of checks and balances of what a publicly traded company CEO says. The idea is 30 million tons a year from that single King Ranch site, not by 2030, but they're seriously talking about that. And the enhanced rock weathering business, which has a lot of deep questions, environmental questions, it is not a slam dunk. And there's some interesting reasons why it's scaling so fast, because it's a kind of easy business to start, it turns out. But still, it's not implausible that could be in many, many tens of megatons a year in 2030. So I don't think it's ridiculous. It's not as much as I would have thought.
So if it's Air Canada, I would add to that, and having had these conversations in Ottawa recently about the government of Canada, let's say the government of Canada wants to offset portions of its operational emissions through high-quality, verifiable CDR offsets, and it wants to run it through its protocol, its DAX protocol, so it chooses a technology pathway, and they really want to run it through this protocol. They put a lot of time and effort into developing it, and they want the projects to be Canada-based. So you can see from the little exercise that we did off the top of the show, those two right now are mutually exclusive. So they're going to cut the ribbon on this great protocol, and they're not going to have any Canada projects that will have a hope in hell of meeting the protocol anytime soon. So I would say be like California, which California has said, we don't care where your DAC project is developed, you can generate credits and sell them into our market. I'd urge the government of Canada to do the same and say, we want it to go through this protocol, we put a lot of effort into it, and we've got a lot of confidence, but we're going to drop this Canada-based requirement because no supplier will be able to satisfy it, but we'll have like an on-ramp over 5 years. So for 5 years, you can source internationally, go through the protocol, but then by 2030, all those projects have to be in Canada, and then I think you have the right degree of market pull. Lior.
Hey, thank you so much. This has been a really engaging conversation. My question is around future markets or advanced market commitments. Tell us a little bit about the opportunity, the risks, the regulatory implications of people charging anywhere from $400 to $700 a ton for removal of carbon that might happen in the future.
And maybe start with you, David, because some of those advanced market commitments, what Lior is talking about, were a driver in getting Stratos to FID. But as you mentioned earlier, the voluntary market will, over the long term, play a small role. The compliance market will play a larger role. So maybe comment on it if you don't mind.
I guess one of the questions is how much that futures market, how to make it. I mean, if you could really make it something robust and give it enough rules, maybe it could tell you something real about where participants think prices will be and cut through some of the fluff. Because, of course, I'm sitting here telling you one thing about prices, which I haven't quite said, but I think for direct air capture, I think getting under 200 is doable with a big fight. Getting under 100, I think, is really hard. But obviously, there are startups that think it's 50. I think they're dreaming in Technicolor and snorting lines of Coke, but I might be wrong. And I think to sort that out, one of the things the market can do is try and actually put money on people's bets, which is actually a kind of powerful thing. So I do think it's interesting to think about how to develop that. The obvious question is how to connect it with other permanent carbon removals, with enhanced rock weathering or ocean alkalinity. And there you have the issue that I think those things might actually, ocean alkalinity, be scalable, perhaps low environmental impact and important for humanity, but I think you can never quantify them with a high accuracy you can injection.
Sarah, let's use the analogy of virtual PPAs. So you were the driving force behind Business Renewable Centre Canada, housed at the Pembina Institute. Pembina Institute is now launching this new initiative called the CDR Centre. And again, it's like BRC. BRC was a matchmaking service between developers of renewable electricity and buyers of virtual PPAs. So not grid tied, not transmission wire tied, but an Amazon acquiring the green attributes of a Traverse solar project, for example. That, in effect, was an advanced market commitment because that contract was in place, and I know for a fact that Greengate was able to use that to go get financing for its, Traverse Solar project. So, wanting to do the same, maybe you can speak from your experience on how that might apply to CDR purchases.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting model that has been tested and I would argue proven now in terms of having helped to scale up renewable purchases. I think it did a couple of things at different times. So really prior to it existing here in Canada, when it was happening, when these PPAs were happening in the U.S., it was a way to get companies that had some kind of carbon commitments to provide funding and pay higher costs for renewables to help increase deployment and ultimately drive down costs, right? And there was sort of this interesting, a lot of the very early stage stuff was done by governments, and then the very early RPSs that scaled that up, and then there was this moment of having still somewhat higher costs, but that were maybe further bought down more quickly because you had this funding coming from companies that had very healthy profit margins and they could afford to do so. As the cost of renewables has fallen further, I'd argue that it's more important now really as a source of capital, and essentially you're using the balance sheet of the PPA off-taker and the creditworthiness, I should say, of the PPA off-taker to then, for Greengate in your example, to go raise money to develop their project, right? And so they have a guaranteed price and they have a contract with someone that an investor is going to trust, and they can take that and use that to raise lower cost capital, which ultimately is quite important when we think about the cost of capital and what that does for renewables, but also is just capital, and you get these things built that wouldn't have happened otherwise. So how might that apply in this market? I think both could be true. I mean, we're obviously very much still in that early stage where it's about having higher costs, and you need someone who's willing to come in and pay for this arguably still quite expensive emissions reductions. And it does seem that there are some companies who are maybe willing to do that. It'll be interesting to see coming out of the sort of messy offset space where you can buy a lot of really cheap offsets, how many companies are still going to be willing to do that when they're having to pay, the CDR price, not the questionable offset price. But I do think that could be an important source of some of those early stage funds and providing that kind of capital that you need ultimately to get some of those projects built.
But I think, I basically gave away her name anyway. I think Jane Flagle's point is that companies can't systematically, that basically, if they're going to buy the expensive offsets, they have to admit the really cheap buying indulgence offset was not credible. And I think that is a way it helps to shake the market out.
Yeah, and I'd add, from my discussions with renewable electricity developers and now CDR developers, these advanced market commitments are actually pretty important. But I would say that it's great, we should encourage it. There are movements to have a bunch of companies make these voluntary commitments. That allows the companies, the developers, to go out and get the financing that they need ultimately to get to FID. But if you're doing that, that should be an on-ramp to your emissions being regulated. And ultimately, I think we want offsets out of the market, and we just want enough companies to be regulated and their emissions managed that way.
Well, and I think that brings us back to, one of the points that I was making earlier, which is that off-ramp looks a bit different. And, arguably now you have PPAs still happening in the renewable space, and it's grown so much because for many companies, it's not about, wanting to do good and reduce their emissions, but it's simply about this is a economical way for them to buy power that they need, or at least to hedge the power that they need anyway. And the challenge is on the CDR side, in the absence of some kind of regulation that forces emissions reductions, you never get there because it's always going to be more expensive than doing nothing.
Yeah. Okay, let's take another question.
Thank you very much. I apologize because there's two questions. The first one is, there's a lot of talk about decarbonisation, and Ed, you said it rightly.
Yes,
there's
a permit for only one question, right? Can we try that?
That's right, yeah.
There's a lot of talk about CO2 and removing that and decarbonisation. But what about sulfur hexafluoride? What about the energy distribution systems? Where are the startups dedicated to removing sulfur hexafluoride, which is 24,000 times more detrimental than CO2? So where are those startups? And the second one is, so Lividian has a voice at COP28. Do Calgary have a voice at COP28?
You have a voice at COP28 with Kevin Krauser sitting in the back there. Woo! So you have one voice. Kevin, what are you going to say at COP28?
This wasn't part of the deal, Ed.
That's a rider in our contract.
In short, I'm actually part of both the Canadian and the Alberta delegations. And having this COP in the heart of the Middle East, some climate people have found it discouraging, some oil people have found it heartening. But I think the reality is we're waking up to this sort of grave realization of how do we pay for the energy transition in inflationary mechanisms. And as far as I can figure out, there's only three sources of money. One is, investors. And they're going to want a return on their investments. Unless you can show that you're going to make money, they're out. The second is government. And unless there's some sort of public good, however you want to frame that, they're out. And then the third and final, I guess there might be a fourth if you ask children, and that's parents. But realistically, it's consumers. And so how can you demonstrate sort of higher utility? And I think that, and I hope that there's going to be sort of a rational conversation around how can we attract investment, public good, and lower cost is the only way this is going to work. And that is sort of my investment, unless somebody can find their parents to pay for this. But I think that's my message. And I really, really hope that sometimes in Canada, we don't feel like one Canada or one team, because we're kind of squabbling on jurisdictionals. And I would really encourage both my Liberal and Conservative friends that we got to show up as one Canada.
David, do you want to take the first question and other forms of removal?
Okay, but I can't hold my back for a quip that, of course, the whole central reality of climate is that kids are paying. Like that is the core, right? We are screwing them and the grandkids. That's the core of the problem. But now I forgot what the other question was. Yeah. There's also people who talk about methane capture from the atmosphere. It's just ridiculously hard. So I just don't think there's a pathway that's interesting. They're different, of course, because methane has this just 10-year lifetime. So in some sense, it's just deeply stupid to work on methane capture from the atmosphere because you can just stop putting it in. For SF6, it's got this ridiculously long lifetime. I don't remember it, but it's hundreds of years, I forget. But capturing it seems just implausible in the concentrations it is, just completely implausible. More plausible, there were actually very early paper by Cicerone or somebody about like laser dissociation in the stratosphere. Maybe there's some version of that, but I think mostly you just got to suffer.
Direct air capture is hard enough, and I've heard the analogy used as you put a drop of dye in drop of red dye in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. You go away for 3 days, come back, and you're trying to remove that drop of red dye.
We're pushing up towards 1,000 ppm at the end of the century. If we
it gets easier. It gets easier. Climate change is good.
And that's 0.1%. And 0.1% is a lot more than a drop of red dye in a swimming pool.
Okay, let's take a couple more questions.
There was a report that came out earlier this year, State of Carbon Dioxide Removal, which was put together by various academic institutions. And they compared the various carbon removal options. And DAC was quite high at potentially 40 gigatons per year compared to everything else. And then there was ocean alkalinity enhancement at 100 gigatons per year in terms of potential. And I'm just wondering if you have any perspective on, you've talked a little bit about ocean alkalinity enhancement, but if it does have that potential to trump all other forms of CDR by that magnitude.
I don't know what those magnitude numbers mean, and I am pretty critical of people who write those papers because I think they're really ill-defined. Like, what is the set of calculations you have to assume that says DAC has a threshold of 40? Like, it seems so arbitrary and meaningless. And I think it also is like trying to see the distant future. What I think about more are what do the costs seem to be and what do the environmental impacts seem to be. And I would say that there are reasons to believe, when uncertainty, that ocean alkalinity could be significantly cheaper and have pretty low environmental impact. So in that sense, I think it's pretty important. But none of these things really have sharp maximum thresholds. That really isn't the right question.
So I want to point out that the questioner is Paul McKendrick, who wrote a book called Scrubbing the Sky, Inside the Race to Cool the Planet. Well worth a read. Scrubbingthesky.com, right, Paul? Check it out. Got your back. I think we'll put the last question to Joe Vipond here. Probably needs no introduction. Joe, I want to say because Sarah and I worked on the coal phase-out campaign in Alberta in 2015, which was ultimately successful. And in terms of influential people, there was no more influential person than Joe Vipond, who agreed to every interview to step out in his hospital scrubs and talk about the health impacts of coal-fired electricity. So, with that as an intro, Joe.
First step, lots of steps to go, though, right?
Yeah.
So, our mutual friend, I'm sure, Blake Schaefer, I was once driving in a car with him. I'm like, so how do you economists graph out civilization collapse? And he's like, well, it's actually pretty easy because the graph goes to infinite, right? It just is asymptotic. It just goes straight up. So I guess my question is if there are infinite costs associated with potential civilization collapse, you could say it's not 100%, but risk of, wouldn't that mean that we as a civilization need to be willing to put in close to infinite amounts of money to do this, just from an economic perspective? And then we got to figure out how to pay for it.
In a word, no, because there are a lot of things that could potentially bring civilization collapse, and each of them have some probability multiplier and some time scale. And so even if you accept that there's more than one thing, then it can't be that you should pay infinite for that one thing if there's another one. And in practice, I think there's quite an array of things that have huge civilizational impacts, of which I personally think...
Reassuring, by the way.
Yeah, fair enough. But I personally, maybe it's going to be less or more reassuring. I think I've said versions of this before on this podcast. I've worked my entire, I guess I have to say it's a preamble. I've worked my entire career on climate. Of course, I care about climate a great deal. But if you ask me what worries me about civilizational stability, climate is way down my list, like number 50. Like I got a lot of things that worry me way more than climate about stability and civilization. I mean, remember the outer end giant climate impacts. Turn the knobs up, going up to 3 degrees C late this century, or a few percent of GDP. That's the kind of scale of what the econometrics tells us. Maybe it's 5 or 10, but it's easy to imagine, bioweapons that are designed cleverly, or different kinds of wars triggered by AI, or just plain old good old nuclear war that has far bigger impacts.
Sarah, do you have a comment? A more encouraging comment than the end of civilization?
Not sure I'm going to sleep tonight. Well, I mean, maybe a bit of a comment and sneak preview of a guest we have coming on later this season on energy versus climate. We'll be speaking with the science fiction author Kim Stanley Robinson about his book Ministry for the Future. We're very excited about that. And that book starts with a pretty harrowing scene. And I think that, there is, taking David's challenge of, we have to spend and think about a lot of concerns that we have. I did say, how are we going to figure out how to pay for this? And I do think that, we do need to figure out how to pay for the things that are reasonable to do. And I think this does fit within that bucket. I raised the challenge of doing so because I think we need to, confront that now as we're both walking and chewing gum, figuring out how to bring down the costs of these technologies, but also to how to have that combination of the, policy discussions. And I think ultimately, social movements, and this gets into stuff that, I'm certainly not an expert on, but that it is those kinds of things that help to create the conditions that allow politicians to implement the policies that ultimately, allow us to get what we need to actually be funded and happen.
And I think that's the trick. It's walking and chewing gum at the same time. It's looking at the short-term risks. I mean, on the short term, I'm pretty concerned about what's happening in the Middle East and it becoming a regional conflict and that leading to World War III. I'm pretty concerned about all the subs that are cruising out there with nuclear-armed warheads on board. I'm pretty concerned about local poop and scoop bylaws, which seem to be failing where I live in Canmore based on my walk in the woods. So that one doesn't bring around the end of civilization, but the trick is, and coming back to CDR, which has a high cost, but as we talked about right at the top, plays a very important role in trying to bring our emissions back down to a safe level of warming, 1.5 C above pre-industrial, whether it's by the end of the century or by 2150, that we need to be we need to be investing now, and our politicians need to be walking and addressing all these short-term risks, avoiding World War III and a terrible regional conflict in the Middle East, saving Ukraine to the degree that we can from tyranny and autocracy, and investing in this longer-term risks that we have. And maybe our motto is, for this podcast, is climate not quite as scary as nuclear war. But yes.
I want to end on a personal one that you were part of, Ed. So I had a 60th birthday party in the wilderness cabin in BC, and Ed was one of the guests. And we were hiking around. There's about 15 of us, my kids and so on. And there was a guy there who's built trails for a lot of years, and he started building trails in that area 7 years ago. And we were at a place where there was a glacier that used to be kind of joined across a pass, and it completely melted away. And as much as I study all this stuff scientifically, and we all work on it, I got to say that was something pretty shocking to have that guy say that glacier was there when he started building trails 7 years ago, and it's not now. And I found that, I think we all did, a little bit moving. There's something, I mean, all of us hike in the Rockies, you see all sorts of glaciers that obviously melted back, but you don't know if it's the last 1,000 years or the whole interglacial, but having that kind of 7-year datum. So I absolutely agree climate change is serious and evident and so on. But I think it's a problem of our political cycle that we need to kind of turn everything up to 11, that somehow it has to be civilization ending and infinitely expensive. There are things that are really worth working on, environmental problems that we can and should solve, that don't have to be civilization ending for it to be worth us spending, many percent of GDP to drive emissions down fast, which we ought to be doing far more than we are.
I would say, David, that pass has become a living misnomer because it's called Ice Pass and Icebound no more. So on that encouraging note, I do want to thanks again to Kevin and Avatar for hosting. Thank you so much. We're so happy to be back here. I will say this kind of a celebration of November 22nd. If those of you who have long memories, 2015, November 22nd was the Alberta Climate Leadership Plan Day, which at that time was government taking the single biggest step on climate taken by any jurisdiction at any point in terms of catching up. So it's a neat day. And I want to thank Shannon and especially Zoe for all the organization and all the tech help. We couldn't have done it without you. And of course, thanks to all of you for coming in and giving up a Wednesday evening to attend this. Thanks for listening to Energy versus Climate. The show is created by David Keith, Sarah Hastings-Simon, and me, Ed Whittingham, and produced by Eva Voinigescu, with help from Crystal Hickey, Serena Gibson, and Talia Grunau. Our title and show music is The Wind-Up by Brian Lips. This season of Energy versus Climate is produced with support from the University of Calgary's Office of the Vice President, Research, and the university's Global Research Initiative. Further support comes from the Trottier Family Foundation, the North Family Foundation, and our generous listeners. Sign up for updates and exclusive webinar access at energyversusclimate.com and review and rate us on your favorite podcast platform. This helps new listeners to find the show. We'll be back for another new show with the International Energy Agency's Chief Energy Economist Tim Gould to discuss the findings of recent IEA reports and what it means for COP28 in Dubai. We hope to see you then.